What if I told you an entire empire was wiped off the face of the earth because of a single shaved beard? What if I told you that a proud sultan laughed in the face of the deadliest man in history, and 3 years later, his entire civilization was turned to ash? This is not fiction. This is not a lost legend. This is real. In the early 13th century, the Khwarazmian Empire ruled over 10 million people, controlled the Silk Road, and boasted cities so advanced they rivaled the greatest capitals of the Islamic Golden Age. But then, one brutal mistake, one insult, one moment of arrogance that unleashed the wrath of Genghis Khan. What followed wasn't just war. It was annihilation. Entire cities erased. Libraries turned to smoke. Citizens divided, executed, or vanished. And in one city, every man, woman, child, and even animals were methodically eliminated. You won't believe what they did to the governor who started it all, and you won't believe what Genghis Khan said after watching the last survivor escape across a river. But to understand why it happened and why it could happen again, you'll need to watch until the end, because the worst part, it was all preventable. In the dry heat of the Central Asian plains, where the sun weighs heavy on the shoulders of the earth, and even the wind carries the scent of something long gone, there lies silence. Not the peaceful kind that fills a desert at dusk, but a silence carved out by absence, by something that was once enormous, alive, and defiant. There was a city here once, so radiant with life that traders compared it to the heart of the world. Today, it is nothing, not even ruins, not even rubble, just dust, scattered bones, and the suggestion that something magnificent once stood between the shadows. It wasn't always like this. 2 decades before, this very land had thrummed with the pulse of markets and the echoes of scholars debating under towering domes. Streets lined with minarets and silk banners had stretched from horizon to horizon, and within their weave, 10 million lives moved as part of a machine so grand it dared to see itself eternal. But eternity, as it turns out, can be murdered in less than 3 years. If someone had arrived in the year 1218, they would have witnessed a civilization at the peak of its confidence. No warning signs blinked red. No omens whispered from the sky. On the surface, all seemed solid. Too solid, even, for fate to intervene. The truth is, when empires fall, they rarely fall quietly. This one screamed, but the world didn't hear it scream right away. In fact, it began not with blood, but with trade. Quietly, almost politely. A caravan, a letter, a handshake offered across mountains. And then, one decision. A single misstep made not out of malice but pride. It would take only that to turn the story from prosperity to desolation. Yet before we can understand what shattered, we must understand what stood. We must look back, not from the ash, but from the height of the spire, from the glow of candlelit libraries, and the marketplaces where gold glittered like river water. Because no fall is truly felt until the viewer first stands at the summit. The empire had a name. Khwarazm. Spoken aloud, it sounds like a gust of wind sweeping over sandstone. To those who ruled it, it was more than a territory. It was a mirror of past greatness. Its kings believed they were the successors of legends, echoes of Alexander the Great, now sharpened into something Islamic, Persian, and Turkic all at once. Their empire reached from the Caspian Sea in the west to the eastern shadows of the Hindu Kush. It draped itself across the silk veins of Asia, like a robe stitched in gold, absorbing tribute, culture, and ambition. The empire's capital cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, were not merely urban centers, they were symbols. Walk into a mosque in Bukhara and you would be met with domes that caught the light like polished gemstone. Cross into Samarkand and the gardens sang, with waterworks engineered centuries ahead of their time. The libraries? They hummed with knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, theology, knowledge that came from Egypt, Persia, India, and passed through the calloused hands of scholars who believed civilization could outlast the blade. But civilization has its blind spots, and in the corners of their vision, beyond the comfort of city walls, there stirred something that did not wear silk or speak in riddles. It wore leather, rode on horseback, and carried with it a wind that never stopped moving. It came from the east, from the hard-breathing steppes, and it had a name that, soon enough, would make children go quiet and kings forget how to speak: Genghis Khan. In 1218, though few in Khwarazm paid attention to the man, they'd heard of his skirmishes beyond the Tian Shan Mountains, of some minor conquests in China, a nomad with ambition, a curiosity for the learned, certainly not a threat to cities whose walls had held off empires. The Shah of Khwarazm, Muhammad II, looked to the east and saw only dust and horsemen. Trade? Yes. Trouble? Surely not. But if there is one thing history despises, it is arrogance wrapped in confidence. And arrogance was something the Shah wore like a second skin. The Shah of Khwarazm, Muhammad II, ruled an empire that seemed untouchable. His banners flew above a realm so vast that its soldiers could ride for weeks and never leave its borders. From the edge of the Caspian Sea to the cold rivers of what is now Kazakhstan, and as far south as the Persian Gulf, his lands were speckled with cities glittering like oases of power. But it wasn't just territory that defined his dominion. It was the sheer confidence that no outsider, especially not a nomadic warlord from beyond the known maps, could threaten the house he had built. To the court poets, Muhammad II was the Second Alexander, a title he embraced with enthusiasm. In his mind, the empires of the past had not vanished, they had merely evolved into his. His proclamations were inscribed in marble, his portrait minted on gold coins. He even challenged the religious authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, daring to imagine himself not only a worldly king, but one who might shape faith itself. When he looked at the Mongols in the east, he did not see a threat. He saw opportunity, new partners for trade, perhaps even vassals who might bring him furs and horses in exchange for luxury goods from his craftsmen. But history is rarely kind to those who mistake quiet ambition for submission. And while Khwarazm admired itself in the mirror of past empires, the East stirred with a different kind of energy, one that did not speak in riddles or delay in decisions. Genghis Khan, unlike the Shah, saw the world not as a series of fortresses, but as a field to be crossed. His empire had no fixed capital, no marble palaces. It was wherever his horse stopped for the night. His power did not rest on ancient bloodlines, but on merit, discipline, and absolute loyalty. By the spring of 1218, this contrast of worlds, one static, one kinetic, was about to meet at a single point. And when they did, the impact would be strong enough to erase borders, languages, and entire cities. It started with silk. A large caravan, nearly 450 men strong, approached the frontier of the Khwarazmian Empire. It carried not only goods, furs, gold, silver, and ivory, but also intentions. These weren't ordinary merchants. Many were Muslim traders, some were Mongols, and more than a few were likely there not just to trade, but to observe, report, and interpret. In the Middle Ages, diplomacy and intelligence walked side by side, but this caravan was not a threat, it was an offer. Genghis Khan had hand-picked the participants. He understood that religion mattered in diplomacy, and so he sent Muslim merchants to smooth the way with a fellow Islamic ruler. He sought peace, trade, mutual benefit. The message was subtle but clear. We are open to friendship. The caravan reached the city of Otrar, a border outpost whose gates opened into the heartland of the empire. The governor of the city, Inalchuk, uncle to the Shah himself, received them not with welcome, but with suspicion. He eyed the goods and the credentials with interest, but his thoughts wandered elsewhere. Otrar had long been a bottleneck for trade. Control of it meant wealth, power, and access, and the idea of a fortune traveling in plain sight, guarded only by legal documents and good intentions, proved too tempting. Inalchuk accused the caravan of being a spy mission in disguise. Whether he truly believed it, or simply saw a chance to seize a vast treasure without consequence, no one can say for certain. What is known is that he made a choice that would turn the world upside down. He ordered the entire caravan arrested, not just detained, but condemned. And with the approval of the Shah, the men were executed one by one outside the city walls. 450 individuals, merchants, traders, messengers, and likely diplomats, were buried in shallow desert graves. All but one, a camel driver, escaped. He traveled east, across the open plains, carrying no trade goods, no wealth, only a story. A single narrative so unthinkable that it froze the Mongol court upon hearing it. The caravan had not been stolen, it had been obliterated, slaughtered, with royal approval. In the culture of the steppe, as in much of the medieval world, merchants and messengers were sacred. Hospitality to envoys was more than a custom. It was law. To harm one was to commit an act of deliberate war, and to harm all of them?
It was an invitation, not to war, but to erasure. When the camel driver finished his tale in Karakoram, Genghis Khan did not speak. He did not rage. For 3 days he sat alone on a hilltop, unmoving. Not to pray, not to grieve, but to decide. The man who had forged an empire from tribes and ambition now faced a question that would shape the fate of millions. How do you respond to betrayal on this scale? When he descended from the hill, the decision had crystallized into something unshakable. Khwarazm would be made an example. But before fire and sword, there would be one last chance, a test, not of mercy, but of clarity. He sent a delegation of 3 envoys, 1 Muslim, to reflect shared faith, and 2 Mongols, to reflect unity. Their message was stern, but not unreasonable. Return the stolen goods, hand over the governor who gave the order, accept responsibility, and this could end. The Shah's answer was not delivered with words. The Muslim ambassador was executed. The Mongols were returned alive, but only just. Their faces were shaved, a sign of disgrace so profound in Mongol tradition, it was worse than chains. It was an insult so deep that even Genghis Khan's closest generals wept upon seeing them. The Khan did not weep, he whispered just one phrase: "He has chosen war, let him have it." What followed was not a campaign, it was not conquest, it was something altogether different, a form of warfare that the world had never seen before and would pray never to see again. By early 1219, a Mongol host moved westward, not as a horde, but as a mechanism, an army of such precision, unity, and relentless momentum that even seasoned observers failed to comprehend what was coming. They did not plunder as they rode. They did not stall. They moved like a tide with a singular purpose, not victory, but obliteration. And leading them, at the head of a force estimated between 100,000 and 150,000, was the man the Shah had tried to humiliate. Now he rode, not as a negotiator, but as a judgment. Their first stop was Otrar. The city that had sparked the storm braced itself behind its walls. Inalchuk, the governor, remained confident. Otrar had resisted sieges before. Its walls were thick, its supplies abundant, its soldiers loyal. But the Mongols did not operate by familiar rules. They did not simply surround the city and wait. They constructed siege engines with Chinese engineers. They used captives from previous raids as living shields. They spread misinformation to fracture enemy morale. They offered surrender, once, then never again. 5 months passed, and then silence. The kind of silence that only follows the total fall of a city.
Inalchuk was captured alive. He was not given the dignity of a clean end. According to sources, molten metal was poured into his ears, a gesture not just of vengeance, but symbolism. A punishment for a man deaf to reason and driven by greed. Otrar ceased to exist. It had been a city. It had held archives, schools, homes, temples, families, all gone. But this was only the beginning. Far from turning back, the Mongol host now split. Like a flood through multiple valleys, it surged toward the other great cities of Khwarazm. The Shah, who had once declared that he would drive the Mongols back to their steppes, now found himself facing a storm that could not be pushed back. Because the Mongols had come not to negotiate, not to punish, but to remind the world of something it had forgotten. That even the tallest towers can cast no shadow once the foundation has been broken. From the scorched remains of Otrar, the Mongol columns turned south and west with precision that seemed unnatural for an army of such size. Most medieval forces marched like herds, clumsy, slow, and prone to collapse under their own weight. But the Mongols were not medieval in the way the Khwarazmians understood. They rode in silence, under banners without gold, with saddlebags filled not with luxury, but dried meat and bone tools. Their power did not rest in how many cities they had built, but in how easily they could take apart the ones others worshipped. Word spread quickly, carried on dust and rumor. From Otrar's ashes, the tale of what had happened, of molten punishment, of total ruin, reached the great cities of the empire. Some scoffed, some listened, all waited. The next to hear hoofbeats at its gate was Bukhara. If Otrar was the border post, Bukhara was the gem. It was not just a city, but a claim, a symbol of Islamic scholarship, artistry, and architectural mastery. Its minarets pierced the sky like frozen prayers. Its libraries housed centuries of ink, thought, and verse. To destroy Bukhara would be more than military conquest. It would be a wound to the identity of an entire civilization. And that, perhaps, is why Genghis Khan did not take the easy road. He bypassed the main approach, the heavily guarded routes where Khwarazmian armies were waiting. Instead, he chose the impossible. He led his troops across the Kizilkum Desert, a landscape so barren that no army had ever passed through it in full strength. Yet the Mongols did. They brought their own water. They carried their own weather. To the defenders of Bukhara, the appearance of the enemy was not just shocking, it was unnatural. They had watched the wrong direction, prepared for the wrong threat. And now, before them stood not barbarians howling at the gates, but men calm, organized, and exact. Panic took root. The garrison in Bukhara, composed largely of Turkish soldiers, attempted a breakout, hoping to scatter the enemy before a full siege could tighten. But Genghis Khan, like a predator long acquainted with prey, anticipated the move. He ordered his horsemen to feign retreat. The defenders bit the bait. They poured out of the city in pursuit, and then the gates shut behind them. The trap snapped shut in the open fields beyond the city. What followed was not a battle, it was a dismantling. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and cut off from retreat, the Khwarazmian soldiers were picked apart with the elegance of a butcher removing organs in silence. When the dust settled, the city's defense lay in pieces. Bukhara opened its gates. But surrender in this war was not salvation. Genghis Khan rode into the city not as a conqueror, but as something else, a force. He stood at the pulpit of the central mosque, where generations had bowed in prayer, and addressed the people with a calm that chilled the skin. "I am the punishment of the heavens," he said, according to chroniclers. "If you had not committed great sins, the heavens would not have sent a punishment like me." It wasn't rhetoric. It was the plain truth, as he saw it. The Mongols did not pillage like drunk soldiers. They dismantled. Skilled artisans were gathered and tagged for transportation to Mongolia, where they would serve the empire. Young men were selected to join the Mongol forces, religious scholars, merchants, civilians, sorted like goods. Many were spared, many were not. No resistance was tolerated, not even after the fact. The penalty for defiance was complete removal from the story of history. The great mosque of Bukhara, once an architectural jewel, was repurposed as a stable. Horses drank from sacred fountains. The Quranic verses carved into stone were chipped and defaced, not in hatred, but in cold disinterest. As the flames consumed what could not be carried, the Mongols left the city the way they had entered it. Swiftly, silently. Behind them, Bukhara was no longer a city. It was a message. But that message had not yet reached its loudest volume, because just beyond Bukhara's hills, the real heart of the empire waited, Samarkand. If Bukhara was the scholar's seat, Samarkand was the crown. A city of domes painted with lapis lazuli, of scholars and strategists, of caravans from every corner of Asia, pouring into marketplaces where spices, ideas, and languages mixed like perfumes in the air. It had withstood sieges before. It had raised armies that marched east and west. To many, it was unconquerable. And that belief was its vulnerability. The Shah still clung to control, though it slipped through his fingers like sand. He sent reinforcements. He organized defenses. But his soldiers no longer marched with conviction. Word of Bukhara's fall had drained the empire of its certainty. When the Mongols arrived at Samarkand, they came not as ghosts through the desert, but openly, confidently, as a wave that no wall could repel. Samarkand's defenders numbered in the tens of thousands. Sources say 50,000, though this is likely a myth of memory. Regardless, it was a strong force, on paper. In reality, it was fragmented, afraid and surrounded. The siege began with noise. Drums, horns, orders barked in multiple languages across the plains. But very soon, the Mongols shifted to their specialty, silence and timing. They sent word to the city. Surrender, and your lives will be spared. Resist, and nothing will remain. Some hesitated, some resisted, most hoped. On the third day, Samarkand's garrison made a sortie, a desperate attack to break the encirclement. It failed, spectacularly. Once again, the Mongols pretended to flee. Once again, the defenders chased. Once again, the trap closed. Faster this time. By nightfall, half the defenders lay still, never to rise. In the distance, Sultan Muhammad II tried to approach with relief forces. Twice, he was turned back. His attempts, far from boosting morale, only confirmed what many in the city now whispered: even the Shah cannot save us. On the fifth day, the gates opened. Samarkand surrendered. What followed was not the clemency of a victorious king, but the exacting justice of a strategist with a ledger. The Mongols did not reward surrender. They simply spared what they needed. The city was divided, measured, and reduced. Artisans were marked for deportation. Young men were absorbed into the army. Others were dispatched quietly, efficiently. It was not rage that ruled. Rage is messy, waste. As the flames consumed what could not be carried, the Mongols left the city the way they had entered it, swiftly, silently. Behind them, Bukhara was no longer a city. It was a message. But that message had not yet reached its loudest volume, because just beyond Bukhara's hills, the real heart of the empire waited: Samarkand. If Bukhara was the scholar's seat, Samarkand was the crown. A city of domes painted with lapis lazuli, of scholars and strategists, of caravans from every corner of Asia pouring into marketplaces where spices, ideas, and languages mixed like perfumes in the air. It had withstood sieges before. It had raised armies that marched east and west. To many, it was unconquerable. And that belief was its vulnerability. The Shah still clung to control, though it slipped through his fingers like sand. He sent reinforcements, he organized defenses, but his soldiers no longer marched with conviction. Word of Bukhara's fall had drained the empire of its certainty. When the Mongols arrived at Samarkand, they came not as ghosts through the desert, but openly, confidently, as a wave that no wall could repel. Samarkand's defenders numbered in the tens of thousands. Sources say 50,000, though this is likely a myth of memory. Regardless, it was a strong force, on paper. In reality, it was fragmented, afraid, and surrounded. The siege began with noise. Drums, horns, orders barked in multiple languages across the plains. But very soon, the Mongols shifted to their specialty: silence and timing. They sent word to the city: surrender and your lives will be spared. Resist and nothing will remain. Some hesitated, some resisted. Most hoped. On the third day, Samarkand's garrison made a sortie, a desperate attack to break the encirclement. It failed, spectacularly. Once again, the Mongols pretended to flee. Once again, the defenders chased. Once again, the trap closed, faster this time. By nightfall, half the defenders lay still, never to rise. In the distance, Sultan Muhammad II tried to approach with relief forces. Twice, he was turned back. His attempts, far from boosting morale, only confirmed what many in the city now whispered: even the Shah cannot save us. On the fifth day, the gates opened. Samarkand surrendered. What followed was not the clemency of a victorious king, but the exacting justice of a strategist with a ledger. The Mongols did not reward surrender. They simply spared what they needed. The city was divided, measured, and reduced. Artisans were marked for deportation. Young men were absorbed into the army. Others were dispatched, quietly, efficiently. But the Mongols did not stop to observe a victory. There were still cities standing, and as long as they stood, they were reminders. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, Urgench. These were not provincial towns. They were legendary, centers of trade, culture, and religious life. They had not yet seen fire, but the Mongols had evolved. What began as war had become something else. Not revenge, not conquest, but a system. One that did not allow for hesitation. In February of 1221, the army turned toward Merv. Known as the Pearl of the World, Merv was older than memory. Its walls were vast, its libraries deep, its bazaars endless. When the city surrendered without a fight, many believed they had escaped the fate of Bukhara and Samarkand. They offered no resistance. They opened their gates. They sent envoys with offerings. It didn't matter. The decision had already been made. Accounts from the period, written in hushed, broken prose, describe what happened next as one of the most organized instances of human elimination in recorded memory. The city's population, said to number in the hundreds of thousands, was brought out in groups. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a number of individuals. One account claims 300 to 400 per man. Whether these figures are exaggerated or exact is irrelevant. What is clear is the method. There was no frenzy, no riot, just routine. The process took days, and when it ended, Merv was silent, a silence deeper than anything even the desert had known. The libraries were reduced to wind-blown ash. The courtyards ran with the memory of voices that would never speak again. From Merv, the Mongols moved to Nishapur. Here the fury took a sharper edge. During the city's siege, a member of the Mongol royal family had been struck down by defenders. The woman who grieved him, Genghis Khan's daughter-in-law, insisted on overseeing the city's fate personally. What followed was not just punishment. It was demonstration. Nothing living was to remain. Reports speak of animals being slaughtered alongside humans. Cats, dogs, birds, all removed. The streets were arranged with pyramids, bone-white towers of skulls, separated by age, gender, and species. It was not chaos. It was inventory. Then came Urgench. This was the jewel, the Shah's last major stronghold. Built on the banks of the Amu Darya, its position made it difficult to assault. Rivers had protected it for centuries. The defenders, led by one of Muhammad's surviving generals, fought not for victory, but for delay. They held out for 6 months, but the Mongols were tireless. They brought engineers to divert the river. And when the city finally collapsed, Genghis Khan himself gave the order to change the... By the end of 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire no longer existed. Not in maps, not in memory, only in ash. The cities that had once stood as capitals of thought and faith had been leveled beyond recognition. The Silk Road, a tapestry of caravans, dialects, and shared economies, was reduced to scorched pathways where only crows and jackals walked. And yet, the Mongols did not leave the land in ruin forever. They had never come to destroy for destruction's sake. After the silence, they sent administrators. Roads were rebuilt. New trade routes established, now under Mongol command. The empire that had been erased was replaced not with nothing, but with something new, something colder, more efficient. A world in which defiance was remembered not by its rebellion, but by its consequence. And across the Islamic world, the shockwaves continued. What had been lost in Khwarazm was not just territory, but time. Manuscripts that had taken generations to compose were turned to smoke. Traditions passed from scholar to student across centuries were ended mid-sentence. Whole schools of thought were never revived. The cultural setback would last for generations. Even demography changed. Entire regions were depopulated. Irrigation systems broke down. Agriculture collapsed into nomadic survival. The scars of what had happened did not fade within a lifetime. In some places, they never did. The Mongols, for all their brutality, had made something clear. Civilization, no matter how beautiful, is not immune to deliberate dismantling. Culture does not guarantee protection, and pride, when matched with ignorance, can be fatal on a scale unimaginable. The Khwarazmian Empire, once a mosaic of brilliance, had vanished almost entirely. What remained were lessons, buried under sand, echoed in ruins, and carried in the stories of those few who managed to live long enough to remember. But perhaps the most unsettling truth was this: the story was not over. Because from the shadows of that collapse, a single figure still stood, barely. Jalal ad-Din, the Shah's son, would soon rise with vengeance in his eyes and desperation in his blood. And for a brief moment, he would challenge the tide that had swallowed his people. But that is another thread. For now, the silence stretching over Khwarazm was not just the end of an empire. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, one that did not simply conquer, but erased. The smoke that drifted from the remains of Khwarazm did not stop at the empire's borders. It traveled west, into Persia and Mesopotamia. It drifted south, brushing against the caliphate in Baghdad, and it reached as far as the courts of Europe, where kings who could barely locate Samarkand on a map now shivered at rumors of a horseman army that left cities hollow and rivers. Yet, in the heart of the wreckage, not all was still. From the ashes of his father's failure, Jalal ad-Din Mingbunu emerged. He was not born into power in the usual sense. His inheritance was ruin. His court was made up of survivors and strangers. And yet, in the chaos that followed the Shah's disappearance, this young prince would attempt what seemed impossible. He would try to stitch the empire back together, even as the seams burned in his hands. Jalal was different from his father. Where Muhammad II had seen the Mongols as beneath notice, Jalal had seen them up close. He understood what they were: relentless, methodical, merciless not because of savagery, but because of principle. He did not underestimate them. And that awareness gave him a kind of clarity. His resistance, though ultimately doomed, would be remembered not for its success, but for its fury. He gathered what remained: military fragments, tribal allies, remnants of garrisons scattered across the region, and for a time, he fought. His forces struck with unexpected aggression, reclaiming cities, ambushing Mongol patrols, rallying others who thought all was lost. His most famous stand took place near the Indus River in 1221, where he fought one of the few open battles against the Mongols that they did not immediately win. Genghis Khan, curious about this new adversary, observed the clash from a distant hill. Jalal's forces were overwhelmed, eventually scattered. But he did not fall in the battle. He leapt into the river, wounded but alive, and escaped. The Khan, watching this act of desperate defiance, is said to have remarked with rare admiration, "Such a son would make a fine heir, if only he were mine." It was not praise. It was a eulogy waiting to be written. In the years that followed, Jalal continued to fight, but not as a king. He became a wanderer, hunted by the same ghost army that had toppled his father. He would never again hold a capital. His power was momentary, like torchlight in the wind. And though he remained a thorn in the Mongol advance, he could not stop the tide. His resistance was brave, it was even brilliant, but it was also futile. The Mongols, meanwhile, continued their work. What they had begun in Khwarazm became a model for future conquests. The deliberate disassembly of societies, their institutions, their intelligentsia, their capacity for recovery was now a known formula. Siege was no longer just a military event, it was a psychological one. News of what had happened to Merv and Nishapur traveled faster than horsemen. Whole cities surrendered at the sight of Mongol standards. Resistance was no longer seen as courage, it was seen as suicide. And in this new reality, the Islamic world faltered. The Khwarazmian Empire had been more than a political entity. It had been a hub of cultural gravity. Its scholars had contributed to astronomy, medicine, and theology. Its architects had reshaped skylines with domes and minarets. Its poets had added verses to the long tapestry of Persian literature. With its fall, something larger cracked. Not just a state, but a cultural continuity. Libraries burned, schools closed. Generations of scholars were either displaced or extinguished. Entire branches of intellectual inquiry simply vanished. Theological debates ended mid-sentence. Scientific progress paused for decades. Where once there had been dialogue between Cairo and Samarkand, now there was silence. And the demographics shifted with equal violence. No one knows exactly how many people once lived in Khwarazm. Medieval census records are unreliable, and the scale of Mongol destruction is often exaggerated by emotional chroniclers. But even the most conservative estimates suggest a collapse. Cities that once held tens of thousands were left with hundreds. Irrigation systems, carefully maintained over centuries, broke down in months. Farmland reverted to dust. Entire regions that had once supported trade networks and urban life were abandoned, becoming the domain of wandering clans and wild animals. It would take centuries, literally centuries, for some areas to recover their pre-Mongol population levels. But perhaps the most lasting effect was psychological.
Fear became a cultural constant. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were a symbol. A reminder that no city, no matter how well built or deeply rooted, was beyond destruction. Even the safest stronghold could be undone by a single diplomatic misstep. Even the most enlightened ruler could bring calamity with one poor decision. The idea of immunity, the belief that refinement, culture, or religion might offer protection, had been shattered. Across the Islamic world, that fear rippled. Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, they all watched the East with new caution. Some hardened their defenses, others opened negotiations. A few, in a move that would become tragically common, adopted policies of appeasement. The Mongol reputation alone, carried by traders, spies, and refugees, was often enough to subdue a region without a single arrow fired. And far beyond the Islamic sphere, other empires paid attention too. In Europe, the destruction of Khwarazm was first misunderstood. Western chroniclers, often isolated and poorly informed, initially dismissed the events as internal strife among Muslims. But as stories accumulated, of entire cities leveled, of an army that drank horseblood and slept in the saddle, the mood shifted. Popes and kings began referring to the Mongols not as a distant curiosity, but as a potential apocalypse. Crusaders paused campaigns, kingdoms reassessed alliances, borders were fortified hastily and often poorly. The Mongols had not just won a war, they had created a new paradigm. What they introduced was not simply military superiority, it was a new concept of war itself. Total war, a form of conflict in which the enemy's society, not just its army, was targeted. Infrastructure, knowledge, population, and cultural memory, all considered valid targets. The term total war would not be coined for many centuries, but its blueprint was etched into the dust of Central Asia long before. The ruins of Khwarazm stood as testimony. Even after the Mongols departed, leaving behind skeletons of cities and new governors to administer the hushed remains, the land never forgot. Ghosts lingered in burned libraries, desert winds whispered over collapsed minarets, and travelers, decades later, would stop at crossroads where bustling towns had once been, puzzled by the absence of any trace. Sometimes the only marker left behind was a pile of stone, or a single broken arch reaching skyward like a forgotten question. Civilizations are often thought of as permanent. Khwarazm proved otherwise. In 1218, it had claimed legacy, dominion, wisdom. By 1221, it had become a memory, with most of that memory recorded not by its own historians, but by the people who had unmade it. And in those accounts, written in Persian, Chinese, Arabic, and Mongolian, one lesson repeats itself with haunting consistency. No civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to the consequences of arrogance, not because they are weak, but because they stop believing they can fall. In the decades that followed, the Khwarazmian Empire was spoken of less as a nation and more as a parable. The scale of its destruction became so total, so overwhelming, that it drifted out of the realm of politics and into the realm of legend. Among the surviving scholars of the Islamic world, there remained a bitter silence, not just about what had happened, but about how easily it had happened. And within that silence echoed a deeper fear, that the seeds of the collapse had been planted long before the first Mongol horse crossed the border. It is tempting to see the fall of Khwarazm as an anomaly, as an exceptional case of bad timing, bad luck, or an especially brutal enemy. But that would be a mistake. What happened was not fate. It was not divine will or unavoidable tragedy. It was the result of choices, human decisions, each with a weight far heavier than those who made them realized. Governor Inalchuk's decision to arrest and execute Genghis Khan's trade delegation was not made in ignorance. It was made in greed and suspicion. Shah Muhammad II's response, escalating the insult by humiliating the Khan's envoys, was not a military strategy. It was pride, reacting as pride always does.
impulsively, thoughtlessly, blind to consequence. These were not isolated events. They were moments of decision. And every empire stands on the shoulders of its decisions. Leadership, when wielded without foresight, becomes not a shield for the people, but a blade turned inward. It was not just the Mongols that brought down Khwarazm. It was its own illusion of permanence. Its belief that walls meant invulnerability, that wealth equaled strength, that culture, deep and old as it was, could somehow guard against the very human flaws of arrogance, overconfidence, and diplomatic blindness. For centuries, the Khwarazmians had thrived at the crossroads of the world, where merchants brought spices from India, paper from China, gold from Byzantium. They had built an empire that not only connected continents, but also blended civilizations. Their scholars preserved Greek philosophy. Their poets carried the Sufi tradition forward. Their engineers designed irrigation systems that fed millions. But none of it saved them. Because in the end, it was not their knowledge that failed them, it was their judgment. History often presents conquest as a contest of strength. But sometimes, it is simply the victory of clarity over illusion.
Genghis Khan saw what the Khwarazmians did not, that diplomacy was sacred, that signals mattered, that responding to an open hand with a sword is an invitation not to dialogue, but to obliteration. He understood something brutal, but deeply pragmatic. Empires are not destroyed when they are weak. They are destroyed when they think they cannot be touched. And the Mongols, for all their foreignness, for all their supposed barbarity, acted not as savages, but as strategists. They offered terms, they honored agreements, they punished betrayal not with chaos, but with discipline so precise it redefined warfare. The lesson is not just historical, it is timeless. Across the centuries, the ruins of Khwarazm stand as a monument, not just to what was lost, but to how easily it was lost. A library can take generations to build, a city centuries to perfect, an empire the labor of entire dynasties. But all of it can be undone in a single season, with the right combination of pride, error, and silence. And in the wake of that undoing, what remains? Not statues, not songs, not the legacy that once seemed carved into marble. What remains is the dust. Dust, and the question that haunts all civilizations. What happens when those in power stop believing that consequence still applies to them? We speak often of collapse as something gradual, a rot that spreads slowly until the foundations give way. But Khwarazm did not rot. It cracked, loudly, quickly, and finally. Its end was not a slow fade, but a plunge. It is easy today to view this from a safe distance, to turn it into a documentary, a footnote, a moment in history class. But to those who lived it, it was not an abstract lesson. It was fire. It was silence. It was watching everything familiar become unfamiliar overnight. It was the realization that safety, once believed permanent, was an illusion. The Mongols did not conquer the world by numbers alone. They did not win because they were more brutal, or more monstrous, or more bloodthirsty. They won because they understood the terrain of the mind. They knew that the moment people stopped believing in their leaders, in their walls, in the permanence of their comfort, the battle was already half won. And when the last resistance was broken, when the last embers cooled, the world did not stop turning. Trade resumed under new rules. Cities were rebuilt under new banners. The Silk Road was reopened under new watchtowers. But it was not the same world. It never could be. The destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire was not merely the collapse of a state. It was the turning of a page in human history. It marked the arrival of a new force, one that did not see the world as fixed, but as moldable.
a force that made entire civilizations recalibrate their understanding of power, war, and survival. And perhaps most haunting of all, it proved that no culture, no matter how enlightened, no lineage, no matter how royal, and no achievement, no matter how vast, is immune to being forgotten. We remember Khwarazm not because it endured, but because of how completely it didn't. Even centuries later, the outline of Khwarazm's downfall remains sharper than most, not because of its size. Many empires have risen and fallen with similar weight, but because of how quickly the fall came and how total it was. Between the spring of 1218 and the end of 1221, a civilization that had taken centuries to build, its canals, its court etiquette, its dynasties, its trade networks, vanished almost entirely. In the modern world, where systems seem too large to fail, where borders feel fixed, and institutions immovable, this story serves not as a tale of ancient brutality, but as a mirror. What the Mongols revealed, perhaps more clearly than any power before or since, is that no amount of infrastructure, no complexity of governance, no accumulation of knowledge or faith can withstand the wrong decisions at the wrong time. The architecture of collapse always begins in the mind. The final lesson left behind in the dust of Khwarazm is not military. It is psychological. In the court of the Shah, before the disaster, there was a moment, a window of opportunity where peace was possible. Genghis Khan had extended a hand. He had offered trade. He had sent Muslim merchants to bridge cultural distance. He had, by every standard of the day, followed the codes of diplomacy. And it was not war that greeted him. It was worse. It was contempt. That contempt, the willingness to see the Mongols as beneath notice, as outsiders unworthy of respect, did more than start a conflict. It erased a people. The Shah did not believe they would come. Then, when they came, he did not believe they would break his walls. Then, when they broke his walls, he did not believe they would stay. Each step he miscalculated, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he mistook power for control, a mistake as old as kings. And yet, the Mongols had no interest in ruling Khwarazm as it was. They had no desire to become part of the Persianate elite, to inherit the bureaucracy, or integrate the culture. Their goal was not absorption, it was removal. Not in this, they differed from almost every empire before them. The Romans had conquered to govern. The Umayyads had expanded to spread faith. The Byzantines had fought to preserve. But the Mongols, at least in the case of Khwarazm, destroyed to warn, to instruct, to ensure that never again would a border governor believe that he could insult the Khan and remain standing. Their message was understood. Long after the Mongols moved on, into Persia, into the Caucasus, into Rus, and eventually into Europe, the memory of Khwarazm lingered behind them like a shadow. Cities would open their gates at the first sight of their standards. Sultans would send envoys begging for terms before a single Mongol arrow was fired. The destruction of Khwarazm had become a myth, but a myth grounded in fresh reality. Even in later generations, when the Mongol Empire fractured and gave way to new khanates, the strategy remained. Psychological warfare, paired with military discipline. Clarity of purpose enforced through precision of punishment. And Khwarazm remained the foundational example. Archaeologists today search for the outlines of its vanished cities. Samarkand has been rebuilt, yes, but it is not the same Samarkand. Urgench exists, but far from where the old capital once stood. Merv is still dust and wind. and the bones of Nishapur's libraries, of its philosophers and poets, are long since buried beneath layers of sediment and silence. What cannot be rebuilt are the ideas lost, the conversations never continued, the books burned before they could be copied, the teachers who left no students behind. These are the costs that do not appear in war logs, that no census can count. And they are the costs most civilizations do not realize they are paying until the silence becomes permanent. Even today, with digital archives and satellites mapping the Earth, with weapons more powerful than the Mongols could imagine, the fundamental vulnerability remains unchanged: human decisions. That is where the fate of every empire lies, not in the strength of its army, not in the splendor of its architecture, but in the choices of its leaders, especially in how they treat those they do not understand. The Mongols were not destroyed by misunderstanding. They thrived because others misunderstood them. Khwarazm misunderstood entirely. It saw the steppe as empty. It saw the nomad as inferior. It saw the invitation to peace as weakness. And so it saw nothing at all.
In the end, perhaps that is the most tragic irony of Khwarazm's story. It did not fall to greed or to external pressure alone. It fell to blindness to the moment, to the message, to the nature of change. And by the time the dust had settled, the world had changed forever. The map had shifted. The Silk Road had new masters. The model of war had been redefined, and the empire that had once believed it could not be moved was nowhere to be found. Just the faint outline in the sand, just a silence where music once played. Just the memory of a door that was knocked on, gently, reasonably, respectfully, and slammed shut with arrogance. And behind it, a civilization that no longer exists. There is a kind of stillness that only follows obliteration. Not the pause before a battle, not the quiet of a surrendered city, but the total absence of expectation. This was the stillness left behind in Khwarazm. It was not peace, it was aftermath. And in that aftermath, the world began to adjust. The Islamic world, once tightly interwoven from the Indus to the Nile, had lost one of its central knots. Trade routes did not vanish, but they warped. Knowledge centers did not cease to exist, but they shifted westward. Where once scholars would travel to Samarkand or Nishapur for tutelage, they now looked to Baghdad or Cairo, and later to cities in Al-Andalus. The vacuum Khwarazm left was not just territorial, it was intellectual, cultural, and psychological. For generations, it would echo in verse and prayer, in the whispered caution of political councils and the hesitant alliances formed in its wake. But the wider consequences stretched even further. In the Mongol destruction of Khwarazm, the world had witnessed not just the fall of a state, but the introduction of a new playbook, one where speed, coordination, and information moved as weapons. The Mongols had shown how an army without cities, without fixed borders, could outmaneuver empires that had stood for centuries, how a nomadic force could reconfigure the very rhythm of geopolitics. And in doing so, they had offered a warning to Byzantium, to Christendom, to the Caliphate in Baghdad. No fortress was safe, no title sacred. Many empires threw and ends with silence. And yet, silence itself becomes a kind of witness. The ruined cities of Khwarazm may not stand tall anymore. Their names may be footnotes in textbooks. Their walls may exist only in sand and satellite images. But what they endured carved itself into the memory of civilizations far beyond their borders. In the West, tales of the Mongol fury merged with folklore. In the East, they were recorded in chronicles and parables.
In the Islamic world, they became warnings wrapped in poetry. No one forgot. And that, perhaps, is where Khwarazm still lives, not in stone, but in caution, not in glory, but in the space where strategy must now include humility, where empires are forced to ask themselves, before every decision, whether they are standing on the same ledge the Shah once stood on, convinced of invincibility, unaware that the earth beneath them has already begun to shift. So when future states look back, when scholars trace the outlines of history's great collapses, Khwarazm remains more than a name. It is a boundary, a red line. The moment when civilization learned that no matter how advanced it becomes, how beautiful its towers or how deep its libraries, if it forgets the fragility at its core, it is already in decline. And though the Mongol horses no longer ride over those roads, though their standards are now museum artifacts, the questions they raised still stand. Will you listen before the gates fall? Will you respect what you do not yet understand? Or will you meet silence the way Khwarazm did, believing it is safety, when it is only the pause before history begins its erasure? In the story of Khwarazm, the past does not whisper. It warns.